Oh, well, this is Richard Curtis. No mas. Jorge Mas Canosa is dead. Long live the Cuban Revolution. Even the international media noticed when the founder and president of the Cuban-American National Foundation died recently, and perhaps it really was big news, for if ever there was a dictator in the sorry story that is U.S.-Cuban relations since the revolution, that dictator was Jorge Mas Canosa. Mr. Mas was a multimillionaire who profited supremely from the largesse of government, as they say. He had quite the deal going, but then divine retribution, or just luck, not from his point of view, of course, caught up with him. Mas died at the age of 57, never having seen his dream come true, his dream of returning to Cuba as its supreme ruler. Mas came to see himself as Dictator Timber. He was the one who could return to Cuba and fill the shoes of Batista, the man the Cuban Revolution overthrew. Oddly enough, the people of Cuba never seemed to get excited about this prospect, and just stuck by the revolution so many fought and died for almost 4 decades ago. The big story behind the news is not that another millionaire would-be third-world dictator is dead, although that is happy news for democracy everywhere. No, the big news is that American foreign policy towards Cuba is about to turn a corner. Many have already commented on the fact that Mas was a driving force in the irrational and unjust American policy of blockading Cuba. But that's not quite true. The political reality of trying to strangle Cuba is that most of the American people are either unaware of it or oppose it. We are not really the ugly Americanos that we're portrayed to be around the world. Our government is, but we're really decent folks. Cubans have always known this. When you visit Cuba, and I recommend this to all, you discover that Cubans are actually much more sophisticated than us Yankees. They know that we have no bloodlust to destroy their little island and enslave them. Cubans know that people unconnected with the mass of Americans determine American foreign policy. Our government is run by and for the rich, and they don't like the idea of Cuba remaining a bastion of life outside of the profit centers of global capitalism. But the point of all this is that the barbarism at the top is not a reflection of barbarism at the bottom. Those at the top who decide do so for their own reasons. Jorge Mas Canosa gave them the appearance of acting in the interests of citizens. Mas was not usually successful because he deserved success or worked hard. He was successful because he served those with power and money, so they kept him around. Our policy towards Cuba will change, not because Mas is no longer here to advocate for it, but because Mas is no longer here to provide the pretense of government responding to the will of the people. Contrary to the picture painted by his fans, Mas was not an engine of U.S. foreign policy, but its front man. He was not the man behind the curtain, he was the man in front of it. As I read these words, it's merely a week since Mas's death, and already the tide has begun to turn. There was a time when any two-bit terrorist or criminal could get permanent legal residency or even citizenship in the United States by simply claiming that they were fleeing persecution in Cuba. The latest terrorist to hijack a plane in Cuba is not being allowed to stay in the U.S. His name, Pupo, and he's not being allowed to stay here after hijacking an Aero Cuba flight last spring. The talk is that he'll be sent to a third country, which is still a violation of at least one international treaty. But the tide is turning. Americans no longer tolerate coddling hijackers. Mas can no longer give Washington the pretense of democratic pressure, and soon the multilateral agreement on investment will undo all of the international trade provisions of our illegal blockade of Cuba. This last one may catch a lot of people off guard, because it will be one of the great ironies of the 21st century. Our government is currently negotiating a Bill of Rights for finance capital, which will grant it the power to overturn any law in any signatory country which interferes with its, finance capital's, God-given right to rape and pillage. The MAI has provisions that will allow corporations to sue governments at any level to undo so-called restrictions on the corporation's freedom to pursue profits. Many here are concerned that MAI will destroy democracy by rendering government powerless in the face of international corporations. The age of finance capital is a new kind of fascism in which people no longer participate in any decision-making. Ironically, the laws that blockade Cuba are also restrictions on the free activity of finance capital and will fall under MAI. Cuba will one day soon live free, in spite of and because of its enemies, our enemies. Venceremos. This is Richard Curtis.